really sorry for the projector. These issues happen just like production issues. You're not expecting, and they just happen. So thanks for coming to this talk. And sorry for being like 10 minutes late. And I think like we are all in a conference about functional programming, and some of you are like, oh, yet another talk about why you should use functional programming. So this is not really yet another talk about monads and giving a definition about monads, or it's nothing to do with like definition of functors, or this is also not a talk about category theory for beginners. This talk is not really about these topics, at least not directly about these topics. This talk is about how could you persuade your teammates or your company to adopt some of the concepts in functional programming. I know that some of you might be working with like some languages that are not purely functional or don't give you a good support to functional programming, and you might be trying to convince your teammates to, adopt a new paradigm. Is there anyone in this situation? Like, hey, you should use Haskell, it's cool. Or, hey, you should use Scala, it's cool. This talk is also about how do you select a language that would fit for your team. And I know this is a difficult task because you have like so many languages that offer some support to functional programming, even though they're not purely functional. And this talk is about like how could you engage your team to actually learn all these concepts in functional programming. So if you're like working with functional programming and you have lots of experience and you don't have problems with your teammates or your company, maybe this talk is not for you. My name is Hanneli. I'm from Brazil, which is a little bit far from here. And those are the things that I like to do in my free time. I like to play Pokemon, so if you're playing Pokemon, let's play together the new game, please. It's going to be released pretty soon in November. So I'm going to give some practical examples, mostly focusing on beginners or people who are interested to bring functional programming to their companies or teams. So I'm going to show you some code, probably not the best code you're going to see, but they played an important role in this presentation because they might show you how can you get your team engaged to learn the concepts. Of course, as a good disclaimer, there is always more than one way to implement the solution. I'm going to show you a case where I actually failed to persuade my team to use functional programming. And to help us to keep motivated, we're going to see some funny GIFs. So this is the raw agenda of the items we're going to see. We're going to start talking about how can we learn functional programming, the problems with some contents that we have available, and how we get people engaged to understand these principles. And then we're going to show some approaches to introduce and evolve your code, or at least the concepts. And then I'm going to show some things that went wrong, and we're going to see some references. So why did I give this name to this talk about menu and degustation? Have you ever had a conversation with somebody and you ask them like, oh, have you ever tried some popular dish? And sometimes they answer, I don't like it, or they answer, yes, I love it, but they actually never tried it. Sometimes people do that, maybe to keep the conversation going, maybe because, I don't know, they are ashamed to tell you the truth that they never had the chance to try this popular dish because it's so popular, so they should have tried it. Maybe they don't want to disappoint you, but I feel pretty much the same way about functional programming. So I've been working as a consultant for like over 6 years. And I could identify similar scenarios with functional programming. So sometimes I was working in a very legacy code and people were like using Java 1.4 to parse a bunch of data. And I was asking them like, hey, have you ever tried Scala? And they're like, yes, sure, it's awesome. And I was like, why are you doing this in Java 1.4 then? So I felt pretty much the same way. And I think like functional programming is becoming quite popular if you compare like the scenario we have now with the scenario we had like in 2009. There are way more conferences, way more talks, and way more people engaged into functional programming. And I noticed that many people have seen something about it, but also many people didn't have the chance to put some code in production. And I think it would be great to see talks about how could you get your teams motivated to use functional programming, how we could start inserting the concepts into a legacy code base, how could you start deploying to production without, delaying some other important thing that you need to deliver, and how could you implement some features isolated from the code base, because sometimes you have a particular problem that you could start solving with functional programming, but not necessarily attached to the main code base. So I would like to see talks about that, and I'd like to show these talks to the people that I was working with. So I was like, well, I'm gonna look for some YouTube tutorials, and it looks like there are many tutorials available on the internet. I don't know if you can see it from the back. The projector is not helping. But you have over 364,000 results for functional programming. And about 300,000 are about introduction to functional programming. So you have like plenty of resources available. Have you ever tried to do this query like on Google? It's a big number. So yeah, I was feeling like, well, we have plenty of resources. Everyone should be using that. But it turns out that many talks that I've seen about functional programming, they're brilliant, but they're not very practical. If you were here yesterday, during the afternoon, there was an interesting discussion about, well, do I need to learn this to put this concept to put it in practice, or should I learn it for fun? I think there are both sides. You can learn something for fun, but when you are working for a company, sometimes you need to learn something to put it in practice, and people are actually going to ask you, why do you want to use this certain technology? Is this going to cause some impact in terms of money, in terms of time, in terms of the costs that we are having to maintain the server? So I've seen like some of these talks on YouTube, and most of them would mention things like pure function is awesome, Haskell is cool. I was quite curious, and I think this is interesting. There are many talks that use the same example to explain functional programming, and they use the example of the shaper polygon class. Have you ever seen some talk using this comparison? I think it's interesting because maybe somebody came up with this good definition or this good implementation for some purely functional structure, which is the polygon. And then everybody copied the same concept over and over again. I've seen some talks that were covering some theoretical problem, but there was no clue how to implement that, or at least not even some sketch of the code. I've seen like many talks about something like higher order functions, monad plus, category theory, but how could I start writing some code to put this in production? It looks like the topics that I could find something more approachable for, at least for immediate production, were talks about map, flat map, filter, reduce. In general, higher order functions were like pretty practical. But indeed, this wasn't enough for my job as a consultant, because I needed to convince a team that was using Java 1.4 to migrate some stuff to Scala. So how could I get them engaged? So I've been working across different teams, and I could make a distinction between some profiles. So there were teams where the people, they had never had any previous contact with functional programming, like they've been doing Java or PHP for the last 10 years, and they never had the opportunity to have contact with maybe Scala or Haskell. And they were also not willing to change their minds and learn something new. So that was quite challenging. There were different teams where the members were willing to learn something new, and in this case, functional programming. They had seen a few tutorials about it, but maybe they never had the chance to put it in production. And then this team was also willing to invest some time and money to do something different. And there were like other types of teams where some members had the chance to put some code in production in their previous jobs, and they were really looking forward to bringing this to the new company that they were working at. So I'm going to try to talk about these three different kinds of profiles of team. that I could work with. So the first example that I have is about the teams that had never had previous contact with functional programming, and they were not that very motivated to put something in production. So things that I had as my goals for these teams was like introducing some concepts slowly, without scaring them. Like, I guess, if you get a team that is not willing to change the code base, and if you start talking about, hey, have you ever seen this thing about category theory? It's so cool. They might not be truly engaged to what you're talking about. It's like that person, hey, have you ever tried this awesome new dish? And they might answer like, no, I don't like it. So it was really important that the team could write something and deploy it, because usually there was like a management group of people that was always asking them to deliver something new to the code base. So how could I combine these things together? And how could I show them like the benefits of functional programming? So I'm going to give you a real example, what I did with Python. I can't really use the real code base because there are some legal issues, but I'm going to give a similar example. So this company, they were into the big data wave, big data hype. And they had many tools to extract and parse data from websites. And then a similar example that I have here, they had a code base in Python. And I'm going to use like my personal wish list at Amazon to represent part of the problem, okay? This is something that I actually did for myself. So I like books. I really like books. I mean, I really, really like books. So I have like 450 items. If you want to give me a book as a gift, I totally accept it. And so I was trying to build something to automate my process to purchase books. And it's not only purchase, but find the best dates to purchase when the price goes down. So imagine that a book costs like $40, and then sometimes Amazon puts them like on sale for $30. So of course, I'm going to buy it. And sometimes they increase the price. They increase it for $45. So I was kind of trying to track these events. But the first thing that I needed to do to optimize my purchases was basically scraping the data. And scraping is a great approach if you want to introduce concepts as map, flat map, filter, reduce. This is a very basic example, but if you get like somebody that's coming from Java 1.4, for example, this is going to be all new for them. So to make your team like feel the functions, I think like using this parser example or scraper example is a good thing. So basically, the exercise that I did with the team was transforming all the imperative Python code base into something more functional, using the concept of map, filter, and reduce. We were using Scrapy, which is a tool in Python. And the cool thing here is that we started in Python and we continued in Python. And this is very important because we didn't add any extra layer of systems to deploy something in production. Imagine if I had added some Haskell here. Probably the management wouldn't be that happy. Even though we would be learning a lot, it would cost more money. So they didn't want that. And the team wouldn't feel that comfortable as well, because if they are not motivated, if you sometimes throw a new language, the members might be, a little bit against it. Something that you can totally think of is like high order functions and then chaining the functions and do something very basic. And then like you can introduce this concept for the team, like map reduce, blah, blah, blah. It looks like a functional code, and the pun was intended here. But I think that was a good exercise to introduce something else, like to move forward with the team. There's a problem in this code. Can you quickly guess it? It's kind of obvious. Are you sleepy? I think you are. It's so I'm going to show you like the one problem that I made sure I would made it fail for the team. It's this line of code here. So when you were like writing parsers in Python or PHP, for example, or JavaScript, it's very common that you chain functions, and then you might end up with something like that. And the problem is that if extract first fails or returns none, it's going to stop your program, right? And this is really bad. How do you fix that in Python? This is something like expectations and reality. So you got your team kind of engaged. They are happy, like writing functions or thinking more about the process of transforming data, and then they step into this. And this can be really, really frustrating, but this could be the perfect bridge to introduce some discussions about functors, about other languages, about how can you make your code keep working and just, ignore what happens instead of just interrupting the entire process of parsing. And you can discuss, like, what would be the ideal scenario here? Well, if you had something like this exclamation point, which you don't have, but some tool that wouldn't stop in case of an error. So the reality was this one. Sometimes you need to implement this string format or format something. But this could be like a really motivating scenario to make your team think of the language that they are using and convince them that they could be using something else, maybe Scala. It's also a good chance to discuss mutability, I/O, and peer functions. So from there, I used like this same example to introduce the concept of maybe optional in different languages for the team. And it turns out they ended up adopting Scala to continue the project. And that's when we moved to the main course. When your team is already willing to work with functional programming, but they never put any other functional language in production. So when you reach this point, I guess like if the team is a little bit more motivated, I guess you can start suggesting books and study groups if they agree with that. And if the company donates some time for learning purpose. And you can start modeling a purely functional scenario with the team, which is an interesting experience. It was an interesting experience for me because you're going to see like the paradigm change, and you need to approach that with the team. Like, how do you teach people to think in functions instead of thinking in classes if they're coming from Python or Java? And I think that was one of the most challenging experiences in my career as a consultant, because there is a lot of things involved. It's not only changing the way you're going to structure programs, but sometimes you change the language, and sometimes you change the entire environment. So imagine for a group of Python programmers moving to Scala. You're going to tell them that, hey, now you've got to use an IDE, because it's going to be more productive. So there is like a lot of concepts involved here. I'm going to give you an example, also based on the discussion that we had yesterday afternoon. For those of you who were not here, we had this workshop I think it was at 3 p.m. And we discussed like how can we compare the functional programming in academy and industry. And then somebody said, well, I'm teaching at this university, and how do I keep my students motivated? So one example that I kind of introduced to some students was like working with different areas. So one good example that I have here is trying to work with electrical engineering. And so I made some of my students to model this very well-known problem of transferring quantities between one thing and another. You might have seen it between glasses, between like other structures, I don't know. But I created this specific example for students. So imagine that you have batteries, different batteries with different voltages, like 9 volts, 12 volts, and 24 volts, or whatever. You don't have any instruments to measure the voltage in a certain point of time, and you want to combine the voltages by transferring some charge from one point to another, and you want to get a final result of it. So for example, imagine you have 2 batteries, battery 1 and 2, one of 9 volts, one of 12 volts, and you must end up with 6 volts in one of them. Do you recognize this problem? No, you've never seen it. Not even in the format of glasses. So this is the problem. You have the initial state where both of them are discharged. So battery 1 is 0 volts, battery 2 is 0 volts, okay? And then remember your goal. One of them must end up with 6 volts. You don't have anything to measure the voltage. So All you know is when a battery is fully charged and when it's fully discharged, okay? So you charge battery 1, what happens with the states? Battery 1 gets fully charged, which means it's going to get 9 volts, and battery 2, nothing happens to it, right? If you transfer the energy from battery 1 to battery 2, what happens? Battery 1 ends up with 0 volts. I'm not considering like electrical engineering, anything that can reduce the voltage when it's transferring. And then battery 2 gets 9 volts. If I charge battery 1 again, battery 1 is going to have 9 volts, battery 2 is going to have 9 volts, okay? And then if I transfer the charge from battery 1 to battery 2, what happens? Battery 1 ends up with 6 volts, battery 2 ends up with 12 volts, right? Does it make sense? And then, this is then because one of the batteries has 6 volts, right? How do I write a fully functional approach to this problem? Anybody? Because if I asked you, how do I write OO imperative approach for this problem, I guess you would shout, create a class called battery. And this probably would be kind of global, a global response. But what is the global response here? So one thing that I approach with the students is how do you model the domain thinking in functional programming. So imagine that your battery set is going to be a vector of ints. You're going to measure the voltage of the batteries as integers. And you're going to create the states. What are the states that I mentioned here? Well, discharged or empty, fully charged, and transferring, right? Those are the possible states. And then you're going to model the interaction or paths between those states. Does it make sense? So you would end up with something like that. You have the states here. You have a trait connecting the states. And then you're going to model the possible interaction or paths between one and another. And then you can represent that as a history of combinations. And then you find if one particular combination gives you the results that you want. Does it make sense? So this could be a fully functional approach, but it turns out that this is also, this is the response. This is also a great tool to introduce concepts like streams, like lazy evaluation, because are you going to keep looking for an answer forever? Or if you find an answer, can you just stop? So those are problems that you can discuss with students, and then you can introduce many concepts at this part of modeling. And I think like this is the point where the team or the students or whatever, they will be willing to invest time and money to continue improving this functional approach. So I think this could be a good time to implement DSL with your team. When like you go through an entire modeling, you can show them that you can have real benefits from functional programming, and this is time for implementing a DSL, for example. So I guess this is the right time to start discussing algebraic data types or have at least a stronger discussion on types itself. And you could even think of moving to a different language like Haskell or Elixir, for example. But remember, like your team must be willing to invest time and money, because at this point you might need some extra cost to set up a production environment for Haskell, for example. I won't have time to show you the implementation that I've done here, but last year there was a talk by Aaron Levin, I guess, and he mentioned something interesting, a tool called Servant. And I think I really like this tool because it helped many of my coworkers to write DSLs. This tool kind of helps them to think about the types, the right types for a certain circumstance, and it's very easy to use. It's written in Haskell, and again, think of the environment here. So if you're going to write something in Haskell, how are you going to deploy it? I won't have time to show it, but the code is on my GitHub, and it's on the references at the end of the presentation. And again, like, it's time for starting a discussion about the types. So back into our original example about the wish list on Amazon. Oops, this is really bad. Sorry. We could think of writing a DSL for dealing with the books, right? The books on the wish list. And I guess one of the final stages is that when you have some team members that are really motivated to bring up some functional approach to your team, they're going to help you to convince the other members that there is a real benefit on using functional programming. And if the level of acceptance is really high, you can see interesting things. So I was working on this team, and there were like two people from DevOps, and they were like super engaged to functional programming, and they're like asking me a bunch of questions like, hey, have you ever tried Haskell? Have you ever tried Ocaml? And they found this thing called Mirage OS, which is a unikernel, and they were working on DevOps. And then they said, oh, Mirage OS uses Ocaml for describing the kernels that you want to have in production. It's a different approach from Kubernetes, for those of you who had never previous contact with unikernels. But you kind of need to describe which components you want to add to your kernel. That's why it is called unikernel. And it turns out that it's written in Ocaml, so the entire DevOps team learns Ocaml and functional programming to be able to use Mirage OS. So that was quite cool. And this all happened because we had two members that were really motivated to change the entire scenario of DevOps, and they ended up like teaching Ocaml and functional programming to everybody. And I think like when you reach this level in your team, I think then it's time to start discussing like concurrence and parallelism. So again, that was a topic that was discussed yesterday. So maybe it's time for some actors model. First of all, ask if you need it, but if you need it, I think it's a good time to introduce it. So your team must be mature enough to go through data modeling to be kind of comfortable with functional programming concepts, and then you can jump into actors model, or you could jump like into Lens for Haskell. There was also a workshop yesterday. And maybe this is the right time to invest some time in mathematics. Maybe this is the right time to go to your colleagues and say, hey, category theory is so cool, why don't you try it? And maybe you can start a study group. So I think this is like all the happy endings. That, for me, that was the logical path that worked to convince a team to start using functional programming. So I had to build like all these concepts, and in my understanding, just saying that, oh, monads are cool, let's use monads, and people will be like, I have other tickets to close in Jira, come on. So I think like this well-grounded approach worked pretty well, except that some things can go wrong. And I'm going to tell you a case where I kind of screw up with the team. It was a team of C programmers, and we were doing like low-level stuff. And at some point, we needed to deal with some web applications for like collecting data that we had in an IoT device, and we had to parse it and throw it on the web. And so I was like, oh, let's do something in Scala. And that was a terrible choice because there were like way too many concepts. So in order to use Scala properly, you need to think of classes, objects. You need to have these previous concepts, and then you can think of functions. So if you grab a group of C programmers without any other experience in any other language, it's quite challenging to deliver a project in 4 months, because it's like way too many things to learn. So I miserably failed on this one. The team was like, no, I'm not going to use that. It's too many things for me. And we ended up like just from C, we created a JSON, and then we were consuming it using, I guess, Ruby on Rails. So keep that in mind if you have a team and if you want to jump to a different paradigm. How much do you need to learn in order to achieve a deliverable code? So I'm sorry for the technical problems. This talk was pretty fast, but I think I'm on time. And I hope you had the chance to get some advice to persuade your team or your company to start using functional programming. I also hope you had more a better connection of what are the steps to learn most of the concepts that, or that people were talking in this conference. And I think if you didn't enjoy the other two topics, at least you could enjoy the GIFs. I'm going to leave you some references. There is, I forgot to put my GitHub, but I'm going to put my GitHub in the end. And I guess we got to, well, do you have time for questions? Maybe 1 minute? So, does anybody have any question? One question, what's your favorite Pokemon?